To introduce our speaker, and he has consented to do so. In fact, is looking forward to the opportunity, and so we'll now have our introduction by Mr. Pike.
Most of you got the newsletter, and the speaker this evening is Wayne Glenn, and I'm sure most of you have heard his show on KTXR Saturday mornings and Sunday evenings, Remember When. I've known Wayne a few years, but I've known his mom and dad much longer than that. But in the newsletter, there was a little mistake. We missed it by 0. Looks like tonight's our night. Treasure didn't show up. Everything. But his collection is 20,000 instead of 2,000 records. So he has considerably more records than 2,000. So I will turn it over to Wayne and let him tell you a few things here.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to do a little arranging. I'm not sure if this will work or not. I have some posters and things that I'd like to show. It may be, could those be given to me rather than me try to make my way through? I may just hold them up when I want to. That may not work. You can tell I've been a school teacher. I just can't hardly do anything without being able to point or refer to something. We'll see here what we can do. I may, like I said, I may just talk about them.
Let me get this water. There's some water on
And
there.
if somebody's real interested, why, they can look at these later. I'm going to talk about 3 things, so I'll outline what I plan on discussing. First of all, I'm going to talk about my family tree just a moment, because it has some Greene County connections. Then secondly, we're going to talk about the history of the phonograph a little bit, phonograph records, generally speaking, nationally. Then we're going to talk about some people from the immediate Greene County, southwest Missouri area that were important or are important in the record industry and in music, generally speaking, so that we can kind of see how many there are. Maybe you can help me think of some people that I have forgotten or had not thought of or was not aware of. So we'll kind of share some ideas. First of all, though, I would like to thank the Pikes in particular for inviting me here tonight. I would like to thank your organization for allowing me to come, and it's my pleasure, certainly. I have many things in common with probably all of you because I love history, have always had history as my first love, scholastically speaking, in education, and I knew when I was a student in junior high and high school that I was going to pursue something of a historical nature because that's just what I liked. And I've been fortunate enough in my adult life to make my living doing things that relate to history. And so I'm a very lucky, very happy person as a result of that. Now, in the genealogy end, I want to just mention this. This is an advertisement, see. I get to be the guest, so I'm going to make an advertisement. The Glenns came to southwest Missouri, to Christian County, in 1855 as a result of conflicts that William Alexander Glenn had with his father and brothers over the slavery issue. And as a result of that, their contacts with Marshall County, Tennessee were cut off. The family was from Marshall County, Tennessee, and before that, White County, Tennessee. They had come to Tennessee in 1808 from Lincoln County, North Carolina, and before Lincoln County, North Carolina, they were in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Robert Glenn, the oldest I have traced, was in Lancaster County at his birth in 1744. So that's the farthest back I have on them. Now, I have 2 family lines that are connected with Greene County, at least, 2 specific lines. I am a descendant of the Abraham Payne family that settled along the Greene Christian County line. Of course, the Payne Cemetery here in the southern part of the county, or actually in northern Christian County, is my family line from Tennessee. And also the McDaniel family that were, of course, very prominent in the business end of things from the Civil War era until the 1920s at least, maybe beyond that. But Bunch and George McDaniel, all of them are family members, and they originated in North Carolina. Okay, that was one thing. Just wanted to let you know I'm local, have local roots. Now, secondly, we want to talk about the beginning of the phonograph industry, and I have a number of items with me tonight which I'm not really able to display. Now, the local things I put on a table there in the middle next to the entrance, that pictures of various people, primarily that were affiliated with KWTO, KGBX in the period 1932 when the organization was founded into the 1940s, maybe early 50s. So there's some things some of you might want to look at when the program is over tonight. Now, that's that. I have other records, but I did want to at least let some of you see a cylinder record. I spoke to a senior citizens group last week of about 80 people. There was only one person in this group that had in their home any cylinder phonograph records. So that shows you that these are becoming very rare. Now, how many tonight in your home have at least one cylinder phonograph record? All right?
We had a next door neighbor that had them.
Okay. Well, that's close. 2 people. I think he's one of the 2.
I grew up with one, and with a lot of them.
Right?
They're gone.
They're becoming very rare. Now, anyone want to tell me what year Thomas Alva Edison invented the phonograph and, of course, the phonograph cylinder? What was the year on that? Okay, that's a nice guess. I mean, I'm serious. It's a good guess.
1884.
1877. Thomas Edison was 30 years old when he patented the phonograph and the cylinder phonograph disc, we won't call it a disc, cylinder record. It was 1877, and in 1876 and 1877, he showed off his new invention at the Philadelphia Exposition, which of course was celebrating what? Our 100th anniversary as a country. In Philadelphia, of course, is where Edison appeared. He showed this off before he patented it in 1877, because the exposition started in 76. He did nothing with the phonograph, with any of that type of related information until the 1890s. Meanwhile, a German by the name of Emil Berliner, who had come to America, invented the flat disc in 1887, 10 years after Edison. The regular flat disc record that most of us think of when we think of a phonograph record was invented. So next year will mark the 100th anniversary of the invention of the flat disc. Emil Berliner and Thomas Edison had a number of things in common. Certainly they were geniuses. Certainly they were ahead of their times. And certainly they were eccentric and were not good businessmen. Now that may amaze some of you, because you may think that Edison was a great businessman. No, he was not. He was a good judge of people, and he was able, partly through good luck, to have good people working for him that had a great deal of interest in seeing that his organization was successful. Edison was not a businessman. He was a creator. He was an inventor. Emil Berliner was not fortunate enough to have good people working for him. Therefore, he is basically lost in history, except for people that are really into, more or less into music and the record industry. Okay, 1887. Now, the next important date would be 1893, when Emil Berliner formed a partnership with a cabinet maker from Camden, New Jersey by the name of Eldridge Johnson. Eldridge Johnson was a good businessman. He stole the copyrights and the patents from Emil Berliner, his partner, eventually in 1901, and formed the Victor Talking Machine Company. Berliner lost everything he had, as far as the money that had been acquired and the copyrights that went with his own patents and inventions. That was 1901. That's the year that the Victor Talking Machine Company was established. Now, when were records first manufactured in mass? When did this really start to where people in the hills of the Ozarks in Springfield, Missouri would be able to purchase a phonograph and phonograph records? About when would that have happened? Well, it just almost coincides with the formation of the Victor Talking Machine Company. which was the first national organization that did distribute all over not only the United States, but eventually all over the world, and established as their trademark the most famous trademark in the history of the world, which is the dog listening to his master's voice. Now, anybody here, I never have anybody know this, and you've known it in the past, but now you're a smart historic group, so you're going to know, somebody is going to know the name of the dog. You were one of my other pros. Little Nipper. The dog's name is Little Nipper. Yes, the dog has a name. 1901. The dog is 85 years old and still got its ear perked up listening to its master's voice. You know, for a few years in the late 60s and early 70s, RCA, when it came time to renew the lease or the franchise, whatever term you want to use, for the use of the dog as their trademark. They did not own it. You see, it's a painting. It was a painting that was done by an obscure artist. I don't remember the artist's name. And they had not bought it. And of course, the family had kept this as their copyright. They lease it to RCA. And so when it came time for a renewal and the family wanted, you know, millions of dollars from RCA for the most famous trademark in the world, RCA did not renew. And so from about, I don't know what it was, 1967 to about 1978, something like that, for about 11 years, any of the RCA records that came out just had the RCA logo, no dog, no Little Nipper. Well, RCA eventually decided, and the family decided to bring their agreement down a little bit on what they wanted. They compromised, and so once again, for the last few years, Little Nipper has reemerged as the symbol of the Radio Corporation of America, which had bought the Victor Talking Machine Company in 1929, when NBC and the Victor Talking Machine Company were combined to form RCA. Now, who were the earliest recording artists to make a hit and to be known to your parents, to your grandparents, and to your great-grandparents? I'm going to mention some names. I have them on a chart, and I'll just say them. Okay, let's start out. Let's think of who would be 1900. I mean, that's when it really happened. 1901, 1902. People like your great-grandparents who lived down here somewhere in the hills, we'll say, like mine, they bought a phonograph. Now, if anybody tells you that it was rare for a person to have a phonograph and to have records way back in time, that's not true. They were very plentiful. People bought them. They bought them even if they couldn't afford them, just like you bought that car that you couldn't afford, or you bought that VCR that you didn't need but the other people had and you thought you should have. The people were doing the same thing then. And they were selling in the millions. I have a friend by the name of Dwight Sprague who I went to school with at Nixa, and he had invited me to come down and see him. He has motels in Branson, and I kept putting it off. He said, I've got a big stack of old records I bought at an auction that I'll give you if you just come down, you know, sometime. He said, I don't know if there's anything in there at all that you want, but you can have them. So finally, after 2 years of procrastination, I went down and visited with him and his wife one evening, and he gave me, I don't know, my mind must have been 500 or 600 records that he had bought for nothing at a local auction. He didn't want them. But why he had bought them was because of the machine that was with them. And what he had was a little bitty machine about this size, a little bitty case. You open up the case, you put together the phonograph. A little green, metallic colored, of course metal, cast iron probably, machine. And it even had the little brochure with it, still in there. It had been ordered from a Ladies' Home Journal magazine, 1902. And I think he said he gave like $75 for it and got the records free. And it plays your regular old-time Victrola records. And he said, I'm giving you the records because he said, I don't care for this. But he said, I had never seen anything like that. I said, well, I've seen lots of phonographs, and I have never seen anything like this either, except in the ads in the old magazines. $7. You would work in 1902 to get the $7 to buy that. You might buy one for $700 if you wanted a real extravagant model. But believe me, American ingenuity has always allowed people to be able to afford things through mass production. And so they had them. Your people had them. Who did they have? Okay? They had the biggest artist from the 1890s when they started out really making records until his death in 1919. No doubt in my mind that sold more records than anybody else was Cal Stewart. His name was Uncle Josh. Uncle Josh and his Laughing records. They sold in the millions. You did not have to wait to Glenn Miller in 1939 and In the Mood for a million seller. You didn't even have to wait to 1927 with Gene Austin recording My Blue Heaven or Ramona to have a million seller. There were records selling in the millions, as we say, from the turn of the century right on up the line. And now Uncle Josh joins the Grangers. Uncle Josh buys an automobile. Uncle Josh goes to the dentist office. Uncle Josh and Aunt Nancy put up the kitchen stove. They go on and on and on, and the public loved them because they were an example of Americana. At the time it was happening, people laughed about Uncle Josh and they laughed at themselves, just like we laughed at Archie Bunker in the 1970s. If we could stand him. Some people couldn't stand Uncle Josh. They thought it was crazy. You've heard of the expression, just Joshin? That was Uncle Josh's word. That's where that expression came from. Not the other way around. Uncle Josh was Joshua, and the term just Joshin came from everybody knowing about Uncle Josh and his Laughing records. Another major artist would have been, let's go with Lynn Spencer, because that's totally obscure. Lynn Spencer was one of the really big artists at that time, and he's completely lost in obscurity. His big record that sold over 1 million copies was the Arkansas Traveler. We'll think of another one. We'll think of Ada Jones. Again, she's lost. We don't remember her. She was the first woman to be a big success that people at the turn of the century knew the name of on records. Okay? I'm not saying on the stage. I'm not saying in vaudeville. But through records, she was a success. And so it goes. Arthur Collins. Nobody remembers Arthur Collins. 80 years ago, this year, he recorded a song that everybody in here knows. You still know the song. Many of you have it. Many of you listened to it as a child, no matter what your age may be. It's still recorded. It was 80 years ago that Arthur Collins sold 1 million copies of The Preacher and the Bear. I'm sure the preacher went out hunting, was on a frosty morn, was against his religion, but he took his gun along. And so it goes. All right?
When did the Caruso record come out?
Okay, you're on the right track. Caruso, from the very beginning of the recording industry, first in Italy through Italian companies, and then in America starting in 1901 with the Victor Talking Machine Company, with which he signed an exclusive contract which lasted until his death, in 1921. He recorded exclusively for Victor. Caruso was immensely popular. Now, I know many of you love classical music. You love operatic music. And please do not think that I am ridiculing that type of music, what I'm going to say. But it's a fact. I've seen too many examples of what I'm going to speak of. You bought a Victor talking machine. First of all, you get 50 or 60 records. In the real early days, you got about 5, 10. But by the time of the Depression, since they weren't selling them anyway, you would get 50 or 60 records. If you bought a phonograph from Victor in 1930, 31, 32, 33, in that era, they just give them to you because they weren't selling them. If that would help you buy a phonograph, encourage you to buy it. But in the early days, you got records free. Victor automatically gave you a Caruso record. I have been in the farthest back point in the hills of the Ozarks and come across many Caruso records. And you know what? Those records are just like new. They've never been played.
Not more than once.
Now, if that wasn't enough, another reason why Caruso was so immensely popular, other than the fact that he was a fantastic singer, but was popular even with people that didn't know what he was saying, had no interest in what he was saying, and didn't listen to what he was saying. In your catalog, your Victor catalog, which you got with your phonograph, which I collect those with my records, you know, things to go along with it. On the, like the third or fourth page, you open it up after the copyright and the introduction and everything. It has records that every Victrola owner must have. And it lists Uncle Josh, and it lists Caruso, and it tells the people what they were supposed to like. And understand, you are on the ground floor in 1900 of an entire revolution in musical taste, a revolution in entertainment. You don't know, how do you have any way of knowing who's good or who's not good, or what you're going to like? So if you're able to read and write, then you follow what Mr. Victor tells you. And you buy Caruso, and you buy Uncle Josh, and you buy the next artist I wanted to mention, John Philip Sousa. Had 2 songs at least that sold 1 million copies. Would you believe that if I see Sousa's band one-sided, see the first records up until 1908, flat disc only had music on one side. Okay? I often pick those up. They are very old. I can't enjoy them to speak of. You do it as a hobby and a part of history, hoping that you doing that will keep somebody else from throwing them away. But I pick them up, but there's 2 of them I don't pick up because even though they are 80 plus years old, they sold over 1 million and they're still around. Quite a few of them. What would be the 2 Phillips Sousa records that sold over 1 million? Stars and Stripes Forever and Under the Double Eagle. Another interesting thing about John Philip Sousa, there's many interesting things about this great March King, but in particular I think of interest is that he was very superstitious. And he recorded from like 1896 until 1931 at his death. And yet he never recorded. Sound like Paul Harvey and the rest of the story here. He recorded for 30 plus years, but he never recorded. He was superstitious. He would not lead his band for recording sessions. His assistant conductor, a man by the name of Arthur Pryor, was the one that did all of the directing, especially in the early days for Susan. And I think Pryor became so famous and popular himself, he went out and formed his own band, switched from Victor over to Columbia, and became Sousa's counterpart at Columbia Records. And so that's kind of, to me, somewhat interesting. Those are some of the early names. I want to take just a moment and give you a feel for that early period. And then we're going to go on and talk a little bit about the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and then try to get into the Ozarks, which is, I know, of more interest to some of you. So I'm going to see what happens here. This may be too loud. It may not be loud enough. Some of you will be blasted out. Some of you won't be able to hear.
The Whistler and his dog, played by the Edison Military Band.
This would be 1 million sold. Please.
Why, all you do, boss, what might your name be?
Hey, what made you think I was ball cap?
Why, I just guessed it.
Well, just guess what my name is.
Of course, that's the Arkansas Traveler, Lynn Spencer.
Well, how long have you lived here?
Hey, see that view over there?
Yes?
Well, that was here when I come.
Comedy, maybe. I want to mention this for those of you that are enthusiasts. Probably if you are really into classical and operetta music, you're aware of it. But RCA is now in the process of reissuing every Caruso record that was made for their company by him. And of course, that's called the complete works of Caruso. And I think they're up through volume like 15 or 16. And they have computerized the material And I was telling Tom what that means. You can probably figure it out. But what it means is they take the master record, the best possible copy of the original that they can find of each one. They computerize, they program their computer to not play anything that is not music. It'd be rough on the rock records, wouldn't it? But no hisses, no hums, no scratches, no clicks, nothing foreign. And it can be done. And through this program, then the music of 1901, 1902 is at least comparable to the sounds of the 40s and 50s. I'm not going to say that they can take something and make something completely different out of it, but if you're a Caruso fan, why, you ought to get started. It's going to cost you a fortune, but if you're into that kind of music, I highly recommend it, because I'll guarantee you, you're not going to ever find an original 78, even if it had never been played, that would be close to the sound of the computerized re-releases.
Tommy Atkins marries Dolly Gray, sung by Billy Murray, Edison record.
See, in the early days, they introduced each song. Oh, I got to ask you why. Why, in the early days of the recording industry, did they have an announcer to introduce the song?
Well, let me see who could read.
Because the people could not read. There was such a large group of people that would not be able to read that they needed to do it. And of course, that's also a form of self-promotion.
There's a song I would be singing to the tune of bells are ringing, wedding bells, wedding bells.
Murray, the gentleman there, was the most famous dietitian? How do you say it? Dialect. What would be the plural? Whatever. His dialects were superb. He was the man. He could do Jewish dialects, Irish, Scandinavian, and of course there was a market at the turn of the century for any and all of those. We had not melted down our pot as much as we have now. We sometimes, I think, and I'm one of the worst as a conservative, think about the Hispanic movement, we're losing our language. Well, we are more English speaking than we've ever been. We only have to go back to World War I and the period immediately before to learn just how divided up we were in our languages. And Billy Murray made more records than anyone ever. He recorded more songs than anybody in the history of the recording industry. Thus, he was one of the major artists, if nothing else, based on output. Let's see what else we've got here, and then we'll move on.
I get dippy when I do that two-step dance, sung by Arthur Collins, Edison record. Now two-step struck this town, it'll turn things upside down. With the
This is the guy that did the preacher there.
I start dancing right away.
Does this do anything for you? I mean, does this music do anything for you? Does it do any more for you than 1986 music?
Takes us back to our childhood.
Okay. Does it sound a little bit hokey, though? Part of it, at least. We call that novelty music, see? I mean, we didn't call Caruso's novelty, but almost all of these other things are novelty. And that's why I have some people on my show that get a little upset with me because I play so much novelty music. Well, with few exceptions and few periods of time, that's the music that people remember. People remember the silly, the happy, the outrageous, as long as it's not just really downright poor taste, better than anything else. I get more requests for String of Pearls and In the Mood, which are not love ballads of Glenn Miller's era, and Three Little Fishies, than I do for some real, slow, sad tune, with the exception of Stardust, which is a favorite, I think, of everybody, no matter what their age. But it's novelty music, and to a certain extent, it has lost its significance other than as a part of history. There's no doubt about that. Let's go on just a little further here.
Well, along last winter we had a revival meeting at Pumpkin Center, and Fred and I, the whole town got religion. Some of them have got it yet, and some of them have shed it just like the cat shedding its hair. Well, I guess we needed it. Things got so bad in our church, we had to have a one-armed brother take up the collection. Well, at the revival, some nights we had as many as 200 come forward to the mourner's bench, and from the testimony they give, it seemed like more than half of Pumpkin Center ought to be in jail.
Uncle Josh and his lapping records. Was, and if you've seen the old movie with Clifton Webb, then it wasn't far from being pretty accurate. He was one of the most patriotic people to ever live. Ultra conservative, not ultra in the sense of being a fanatic against people that didn't believe the way he did, but ultra in the sense that he'd do anything for his country. Ultra patriotic, maybe. Let's see if you remember this fellow. He appeared in Springfield, this next guy, we're moving up a little bit in time. He appeared at the Shrine Mosque in 1928.
Ah, you're a lad, Harry. Hello, Glasgow. And what about Edinburgh and Greenock?
Oh, well, I'll tell you. I'm very glad to see everyone here. I tell you, we're going to have a great next one. And before we go, we need to forget to have a wee joke and Doris.
Sir Harry Lauder.
A wee joke and Doris. Just a wee drap back door. Just a wee...
Harry Lauder was Sir because of the great contribution that he made during World War I to the cause of the American, English, British Isle forces, of course, in the war effort. He was knighted in 1918, not only because of the great amounts of money that he raised for their cause, but also he gave his only son in the war effort. His son was killed in World War I. Of course, he was Scottish, pure and simple. And from 1895 or thereabouts until the mid-1930s, he made many phonograph records and was one of the most famous Scottish or foreign people to make records in the United States. And his records are not rare. And I think at this point, I probably should talk a little bit about rarity in records. Now, logically speaking, which would be the rare record? The one that sold 1 million or the one that sold 1,000? Obviously, the one that sold 1,000. And yet we get our material kind of turned around, twisted around on what's rare. Quite often at Christmas time, I will have someone say, I have a copy of Bing Crosby singing White Christmas. Is that rare? No. It's the largest selling record in the history of the world, selling certainly 25 to 30 million copies, probably more than that worldwide. It's hard to, keep accurate records on something that's been going on since 1942 when he first recorded it. No, that's not the rare record. Under the Double Eagle is not the rare record. My Blue Heaven, Stardust, Rock Around the Clock, Heartbreak Hotel, in more contemporary terms, those are not rare. The ones that are rare are the ones that didn't sell, worth nothing, and that are so obscure that hardly anybody, the average person, wouldn't recognize the song, nor probably the artist in many cases. And what period of time, if you were guessing from 1900 to 1970, let's say, what period of time would you guess would be the rare record era? Where, as a collector of 78s of the old style records, I would be looking. What period of time would the records have sold the least in? Depression. Just like with Depression glass, just like Depression silverware, or anything else almost that you can think of, from late 29. Actually, the record business was in a recession before 29. but you just kind of landmark and write it off there, October 29 to about the middle part of 1935. Almost any record in that 5 or 6 year period is comparatively rare. Now that doesn't always mean valuable, because it may be something no one wanted then and doesn't want now. But the famous artist, whether it be in country music or whether it be Bing Crosby in popular music, that is the era that you look for. And when I run onto a stack of records from that era, I am, really excited if I can find them in good shape, because they are hard to come by. Probably as rare a record as I know of from that era is, for you country people, country fans, is Jimmie Rodgers, the Blue Yodeler. When he died in 1933, he was kind of like Rudolph Valentino or Caruso to country people. Had a big following. It was a tragic loss not only for his family and for his fans, but for his company, RCA. And seeking to do something to try to gain back a little money, RCA had the big thing. They didn't know there was a depression. People kept saying, Herbert Hoover kept saying, we're coming out, or we're not even really in a depression. And of course, when Roosevelt took over, he wanted us to say, we're not in depression. You got to get out of that psychological framework that says you're in depression. So remember, many of you grew up, you know what I'm talking about. You knew you were in depression, but the people and the companies kept saying, no, we're not. Or we're going to do this, or we're going to do that to show we believe in America, and we're not in depression. Well, RCA put out a picture record of Jimmie Rodgers. It was in the whole wax, the whole thing, front and back. Jimmie Rodgers, the death of, a memorial to the great Blue Yodeler. It sold, instead of for 75 cents, which was the going price for phonograph records in 1933, you could buy a copy for $5. Now, how many of those sold when you consider that $5 in 1933, bring it up to 1986, would have been the equivalent of probably $50 at least. It'd sell worth nothing. They took it off the market after a couple of months. Approximately, maybe, we don't know, again, the record keeping was not extremely accurate then, but probably at the most 2,000 of those sold. And many of that 2,000 probably didn't sell. They were left gathering dust at Hoover's and Lime's and the music stores of that era. So it's rare. It's very collectible. It's his rarest and most collectible record for a number of reasons, but the biggest of which is that it's a picture record, but also that it's from that golden year of 1933. So, okay, list a little more, and then we're going to get to the anybody in the whole house here know who that is.
He looked them all over one by one, and then told them to their face. Brother, it ain't nobody's business but my own, what I do when my bridges blew. So kindly please stop messing around my own.
I'll give you a gold star.
Leave me alone. What I do in church, you all can see. So never mind worrying about me.
His name,
privately.
Bert Williams.
Nobody.
If anybody remembers the name Bert Williams, that's him. Very famous, the most famous black person certainly of his time. Any more of you know this?
I'm happy, so happy, walking on air, the wire somewhere for.
Mammy.
It's someone I care for.
Al Joshin.
I'm telling folks every go around me. Let it blow and storm, I'll be warm.
Now, that's the first half of my regular program. Now, the other half, you'll have to have me back sometime, because then I'll go on into the 30s and 40s and 50s, and we'll talk about the big band era. But tonight, I want you to help me create a list. This Greene County and Southwest Missouriites who are, let's start out with nationally known. Let's see if we can find any musicians who originated in Southwest Missouri. We're going to leave out northern Arkansas. We're not going to take in the whole Ozarks. Let's don't even do Porter Wagner, okay? Because now it's a pretty limited list, but there might be a few surprises along the way. Now, it does not have to be a recording artist, but it has to be a famous musician from the Ozarks. All right, Jim Lowe is probably about as obvious as any there would be. We visited with him on the phone the other night on our show on Sunday night about a month ago. Had a real nice conversation with him. He graduated at Central High in 41. Were you in the class?
Right.
Okay, great. And he has, of course, contributed a great deal. He had two songs that were extremely popular nationally. He wrote one of them, Gambler's Guitar, and he sang the other one, which was Green Door, which was a national #1 hit in 1956. And his family certainly has roots in the Ozarks and in Springfield in particular. His brother, Arch Lowe Jr., is a physician, and his father, Arch Lowe Sr., was, of course, a physician before that. So Jim Lowe is one of them. Anybody else
Percy
that you
Winter.
say would be nationally known?
Percy Winrich.
Okay, now Percy Winter is from Joplin,
Joplin.
which makes him classified. We're going to put him down. You're not
Pat
kidding.
Boone's father-in-law.
Well,
He wasn't from here, though.
we're gonna try to stay with people that were from the Ozarks.
Wasn't he from Mill?
Well, he's from Blue Lick, Kentucky, and lived here for what, 7 years?
Okay.
No offense,
Many
though.
years ago, they lived the next block to us.
Yeah, right. I want to talk about these when he mentions it. Percy Winrick, or Weinrich, if you prefer. Are you the only one that knows who he was?
You know.
Anybody besides these two musicians? He wrote songs. He was married to a lady who did sing named Dolly Kay. We're talking way back. We're talking 1900 to 1930. He died in 1952, but his era of songwriting was primarily from 1900 to 1930 or so. His wife was pretty successful on the Columbia record label in the World War I era. I think his father, maybe you know the story on this, I think worked for the waterworks. I think he worked for the Joplin Waterworks. So Weinrich was a native of Southwest Missouri there at Joplin. And he wrote some songs. Did he write Red Wing? No, he didn't write Red Wing. That's Kerry Mills.
Put on your old gray bonnet.
Put on your old gray bonnet. When you wore a tulip.
On Moonlight Bay.
On
On Moonlight Bay.
Moonlight Bay.
Dixie Blossoms.
I believe he did write Snow Deer.
Dixie Blossoms.
Yeah. So he had a number of songs at that time that would have made him a major celebrity, a major force to be reckoned with on Tin Pan Alley in New York City. He, of course, did not stay in the Ozarks. When he began to become successful, he moved to New York, and that's where he met his wife and all. But he is a native of here. Sir, you were going to tell me somebody or give us an idea.
Richie Robinson.
Okay, R. Richie Robinson, who was a Scottishman. He was born in Scotland, was he not?
Yeah.
And he established the largest Boy Scout band in the world. I have two of the records with me here tonight. I don't know again if we'll get them out or not. That's up to you. Later, some of you want to see them.
Little Hoover. Little Hoover's little band.
1920s, 1930s. Of course, the idea of the Boy Scout band continued for many years. And they made two records for Brunswick. Now, Paul Mitchell, the late Paul Mitchell, who was a member of that band, told me that those two records, were you in the group that made the records? You were? Weren't they made at the Martin Piano Company? You went somewhere else to make them?
Made in St. Louis.
Okay, you went to St. Louis. I had in my mind, he had told me that they were made on the second or third floor of the old Martin Piano Company, but not so.
We did make a recording there, but not the two that you have.
Okay, well, Paul mentioned that, so I'm sure that's what he was referring to. You know the name of the four songs, by chance? I've already told two of them, because Sousa had already done it.
Legal and Stars and Stripes Forever, and that whistling song that you played a while ago, we had a hired whistler that did it for us with Reuben Off.
All right, Reuben Off, the great violinist. Okay, Reuben Off and the Stradivarius. Brunswick, the year was 1928, I believe, that the two Brunswick records were made. Now, I want you to know, we're talking about rarities. If we were talking nationwide, then certainly those records would be rare. But I still run onto those Brunswick records in the auctions and garage sales of the Ozarks a great deal. And I, could have a number of them, and I just, I don't try to be a complete hog about things, even though it may seem that way. I don't just keep buying everything, and so I have a copy of each, and so I have not bought others, but I have seen numerous ones. I would say, if I were guessing, that for every member of the band, there must have been at least 10 records sold. So I don't remember how many people were in the band, but I would guess for a city the size of Springfield, they did very well and were bestsellers. R. Ritchie Robinson was a native of Scotland. He was not an Ozarks native, but certainly the tremendous contributions he made, he deserves to be mentioned in what we're doing. All right.
Dottie Dillard.
Dottie Dillard. She, of course, was a member of the Anita Kerr Singers, probably the most famous group to come out of the 1950s and 60s on the Nashville scene, and certainly deserving of recognition.
Well, James.
Dottie Dillard, I want to say, glad to have you with us. Really, because we're not being, we're not just saying that. That's the case. Thousands of records, I believe, that you backed up people on.
How about the Weaver brothers?
Okay, Joe Haynes. Then we'll get to the Weavers. That's from my territory. Joe Haynes was a native of Webster County, Marshfield, Missouri. When his father died as a result of a railroad crash, Joe moved to Springfield, where he lived with his aunt. And I think Joe had a sister. I believe the two of them then lived here, went to school at Greenwood, briefly to Drury, but by the time he got to college age, which would have been 1929, 1930, he was discovered by a well-known band leader of that era by the name of Ted Weems. Ted Weems had songs such as Heartaches and many other songs. Weems would, I would say, be one of the top 10 band men of the 1920s. Weems came to Half a Hill and other points in this area and liked what Joe Haynes had to offer as an arranger. He took Haynes to Chicago, where Haynes stayed for a year or so before establishing his own band, at which point he called upon 2 or 3 people who were from the immediate Springfield area, Paul Mitchell, and the 2 boys whose father was a Chevrolet car agent here in Springfield. Skeeter and Happy Palmer. And their home was located, a real nice home, on the corner of Sunshine and National. The northwest corner there is where the Palmer house was. And these boys worked with him. John Langsford, probably the tallest musician of his time, was also from Springfield. Of course, Les Langsford is his nephew. And those 4, all from Springfield, became nationally successful with the Joe Haynes Band. Now, Joe Haynes had the band more or less from about 1931 to 1935, at which point he sold his band to Tommy Dorsey, who had just broken up with his brother and needed men to establish a band. And so they all, more or less, except Haynes, who took the money and ran, went with Dorsey at least for a while. Now, Paul Mitchell, who deserves recognition also, locally and nationally, decided after just about 4 or 5 months that he did not want to stay on the road. He wanted to marry, and he returned to the Ozarks and worked at KWTO more or less from 1937 until approximately 1974, I believe, maybe 73, when he more or less retired, although he stayed interested in music. Would have to say that he retired after nearly 40 years.
Can I tell you something about Joe Haynes?
You might, because you want to write it down.
He couldn't get in to the Boy Scout band because he couldn't keep time. He came to my mother and he says, I can't get in the band. And Mother says, why? She says, I'll teach you to keep time. And my mother taught Joe Haynes how to do this.
Did he get in the band? R. Ritchie Robinson, did he get in the band? Boy Scout?
Not in the Boy Scout band. He was a little bit too old.
I was not aware of that. I didn't think he was.
But then he learned to keep time with my mother sitting there beating his fingers against the table. I remember it because I was much older.
Than him. Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Okay. He is deceased. Joe Haynes died in the mid-60s in Texas. His collection of his arrangements, his record collection, and all those things are, I believe, at the University of Texas. I believe that's what Arvella is his sister?
Yeah.
I believe that's what she told me, and that's been a few years ago. Okay, somebody else. I want to mention a name. Sir?
Dallas Bartley.
Dallas Bartley, a great bass player. Black, from the north side, became a very prominent bass man with Louis Jordan's Timpani 5, which did Choo Choo Boogie and a lot of other swinging tunes, particularly of the 1940s. And Bartley was with Louis Jordan off and on for at least 20 years. And I know Mr. Bartley told me not long before he died that he had just had a reunion session with Louis Jordan, and before Jordan died. Jordan died first, but anyway, Mr. Bartley, very prominent. And he also had his own band. And I get catalogs of records that are available all over the United States, reissues, you know. And I recently received a list there of miscellaneous artists, and there was an album of Dallas Bartley, of his band. I would think that would be nothing against Mr. Bartley, but rather obscure, certainly, in terms of the sales. His records did not sell well, other than with Louis Jordan's band, which were million sellers. Dallas Bartley, black, and bass man, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. Who else?
Band members?
Well, anybody that would be recognizable.
John Park played a number of years with Sam Kent.
Okay, now I don't know
Saxophone
that name.
player.
I want to mention Stan Reitsma.
Saxophone player.
Certainly want to mention Stan Reitsma.
Yeah.
The Reitsman brothers. I suppose that Stan was not one of the brothers. The Stan Reitsman is the cousin of Claire Reitsman, who lives here in Springfield. They are not natives. Claire told me this. They are not natives of Springfield. The Reitzmans are originally from Oklahoma, I believe. They came here when quite young, and the fathers were the Reitzman brothers, and they were the biggest band, the most widely known band in southwest Missouri in the jazz era of the 20s, before Joe Haynes. They were prominent, particularly in the mid and late 20s. And anybody correct me or add to that, Stan Reitzman became, I would say, certainly one of the top 10 piano studio men. Now, when I say that, I do not mean Stan Reitzman made a lot of records and everybody said, I'm going to buy a Stan Reitzman record. They didn't always know, as with Dottie Dillon, they didn't always know that they were buying the Stan Reitzman record. But if you want a perfect example of how good Stan Reitzman was, get Morris Staloff and his orchestra doing the theme from Moonglow, the theme from Picnic, the movie, the William Holden, Kim Novak movie of 1956. And you will hear a long series of works there by Mr. Reitzman. He has a major part on the piano. And in fact, no doubt about it, he made that record one of the number one songs of 1956, the same year that Jim Lowe had Green Door. Now, Reitzman was very varied. He also did a lot of jazz work and made a number of albums with Pete Fountain in New Orleans. So he could do almost classical music, but he could also do straight Dixieland jazz. And I'm always interested when I get a new album of old music and notice that the piano player is Stan Reitzman. And for your information, since we're talking about famous people, Stan Reitzman was an original member of Spike Jones and his City Slickers. 1942. He didn't stay with them long because they were going to travel. And Reitzman, by that time, was wanting to spend time in California. He had decided that he could make as much or more money as a studio musician in California as he could traveling with Jones's band. Because Jones was just getting started. He had had his first hit. Reitzman was on Der Führerspace, which was Jones's first hit in 1942. Reitzman was the piano player on that, but he didn't stay with him. He didn't stay with Jones. He stayed where the money was certain. Who else?
So I mentioned the Weaver brothers.
Weaver brothers. We've got to talk about, there were a number of Weaver brothers, but the two most prominent were from Ozarks, Missouri, which is, of course, down my way, Christian County. And in the things that I brought with me tonight, I brought the rarest item in the bunch of stuff there, pictures and so forth, is a postcard that must be about 1910. It was not used, so therefore it's not stamped. So I do not know for sure. But of the two brothers, it says the Weaver brothers, and I would say 1910 would have been when the picture was made. Now, you want to tell me what the Weaver brothers' names were?
One was Frank.
Yeah.
Frank, but on the show, on the stage, he used what? Cicero? Cicero was Leon, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And Abner was Frank.
Uh-huh.
That's very confusing. Is it the other way around? All right. Abner was on the stage known as Cicero. All right? It's very confusing. I don't know why. No offense to them, but I think their original names were just as funny as the names they took. I mean, you know, I don't get the difference. And I was always confused by that. That's two brothers. Then Charlie was the youngest brother. He was more or less their manager, and he's only been dead a few years. There were other brothers. They were from Ozarks. Elvira, I wanted to know, somebody tell me where she was from. I don't think she's a native. No, she's not their sister. No, she was married to both of them.
Yeah, married to both of them.
Not at the same time. Elvira was married to Frank first. Is that no? To Abner first, and then to Cicero.
Yeah.
They called her their sister.
That was partly because of what we're saying.
Jan Howard.
I mean, that's just the way it was. History, there's no use trying to cover up history. You're a history organization, so we might as well just tell it the way it was. They were from Ozark. The Weaver family cemetery down there in Ozark, it's an old cemetery. Their ancestors were slaveholders, and they were one of the most prominent families in Christian County. They were one of the most well-to-do families in Christian County. But the boys made that horrible mistake of going into show business. Because you know, if you'll think about it, that up until, in many cases it might still be the same, but up until, say, 25 or 30 years ago, there wasn't any worse profession that you could come home to your parents and say, Dad, I'm going to join the circus. Well, that just been like saying that you were going down below. Dad, I'm going to join the carnival. I want to go be a singer. That was a terrible, terrible thing, especially in the Bible there. That's just like saying, I'm just going to be no good. And so they made that horrible decision, and in the process, the Weaver brothers became one of the major vaudeville acts, one of the touring concert acts of our century. And we're not being proud when we say that. They were internationally successful. And we could talk about them all night. Who else?
Jan Howard.
You had the Haynes around, they sung around.
Haynes, the Hayden family over there.
Junior and
Right? I wanted to just say it this way. When we start mentioning Slim Wilson, Bill Rain, Goo Goo Rutledge, Lenny Ailshire, these people, Aunt Martha, the Goodwill family, the Hayden family, we all put those under Ralph Foster, who could really not sing. I have the album here, the narrations he did of Burt Williams material. He loved Burt Williams so much, and did the album of Burt Williams songs, recitations more or less. Ralph Foster brought all of that here. What anybody may want to say about him, good or bad, the fact is he's the one responsible for putting Springfield on the map in terms of these names that you're mentioning. Now, is there anybody else? Yes.
I don't, and that's not exactly what you're talking about, but not very many people know that Gene Austin's wife came from here.
Right. Gene Austin, famous singer I've spoken of a couple of times tonight, was married at one time to a lady from Brighton, Missouri. She was an aunt of Jimmy Gately, who also had some notoriety as a result of working with Ralph Foster in the Jubilee shows. That's right. And she's still alive, and I was told she's working on a book on her life with Gene Austin.
Was Brenda Lee from this area?
No, she's originally from way down south in Montgomery, I believe. No, Atlanta. She's from Georgia. Born in Georgia. I guess she lived here, 3 years? Actually lived here and went to school about 3 years. Everybody seems to have went to school with her. Yes?
Morris Holmes.
Okay, now you're going to have to tell me who that is, see? Because I don't know.
He played first trumpet for R. Richie Robertson, and then he was the director of the Ringing Brothers Barnum Bailey Circus Band for the rest of his life.
How do you spell that? I want to write that down.
M.O.R.
Brothers. All right, let me see if there's any, there's 2 or 3 I've got to mention, then can I?
Dr. Elkins used to play with the Reitsma
All right.
orchestra.
All right.
Jan Howard's another.
I've got 2 or 3 that I've thought of that you wouldn't have necessarily thought of. They're not all necessarily from Greene County, but they are from southwest Missouri. First of all, I want to mention the name Blind Boone.
Columbia.
Blind
Columbia,
Boone
yeah.
was the fellow that
Jenkins.
was a black man. His mother was a former slave. When she ran away from slavery at the latter part of the Civil War in 1864, she had this boy. He was blinded at 6 months of age as a result of an illness. He had no father. She was a cook there on the Union line in northern Missouri. And Blind Boone is worthy of being mentioned in terms of southwest Missouri history because he wrote in 1880 the Cyclone of Marshfield, or the Marshfield Cyclone, which was a song about a cyclone, tornado, as we would call it, that hit Marshfield, Missouri on April 18, 1880. And did you know that that manuscript was destroyed? It was never recorded. In 1880, there were no records to speak of, but later on, it was not ever recorded, and there is no existing manuscript to the exact phrasing words of the Marshfield Cyclone. So if somebody here has one or has access to it, certainly the archives in Columbia would love to have it, and anybody else would love to have it. It does not exist, as I understand it. All right, may I go ahead here? Fiddlin' Sam Long. Does that mean anything to you at all? Fiddlin' Sam Long was probably the first Ozarker to make a phonograph record. He was not, as I said, from Springfield. He was from Seneca, of course, in McDonald County. And Sam Long made a number of records for the Jeanette Company, Star Piano Company, Richmond, Indiana, in 1926, just a couple of years before the Boy Scout Band. Another name that I will mention, historically speaking, the Macedonia Quartet. Anybody remember, hear of? I talked to one of the members of the Macedonia Quartet about 10 years ago. He was the only living member. They were ministers and religious men from Lawrence County, particularly Lawrence County. I think one of